Hello, and welcome back. And if you are listening from somewhere quiet tonight, from a room with a dim lamp, or from a bed that still remembers the weight of the day, you are very welcome here. As always, before we begin, you can like the video if you feel like it, or subscribe if you would like to wander back here again another night. And if you want to, you can leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I always like imagining these stories drifting out through dark windows into different cities, different clocks, different sleepless corners of the earth. Tonight, I want to begin in a place that had not yet decided what it was becoming. Not quite peaceful, though it still had churches. Not quite broken, though people had already started speaking in the careful tones that belong to places beginning to crack. Not yet a battlefield, though the wood for wagons was being cut, the iron for tools was being hammered, and the narrow streets of Prague were already learning how quickly a crowd could stop being a crowd and become something more troublesome, which, in fairness, is one of humanity's oldest hobbies. A city can look ordinary for a very long time while storing up a remarkable amount of grievance. It can have market stalls, church bells, smoke rising from cook fires, apprentices carrying bundles, women hauling water, priests reciting familiar words, and somewhere beneath all of it, invisible but very much alive, there can be irritation, slow, patient irritation, the kind that grows not because of one grand disaster, but because of 100 smaller indignities that settle on people one by one like soot. A coin worth a little less than it was last year. A tax that feels a little more shameless than the one before it. A sermon about holiness, delivered by a man wearing enough embroidered cloth to ransom 3 families. A ruler who seems far away even when he is nearby. A church that speaks about eternity while owning quite a lot of land. A city where the language of prayer and the language of your own mother are not quite the same thing, and you begin to wonder why God should always sound more comfortable in someone else's mouth. That sort of thing. These are not dramatic grievances at first. They are not the kind that arrive with trumpets. They arrive in small, practical, irritating forms. Bad money, uneven justice, a priest who eats well, a labourer who does not. The feeling that the people above you are forever explaining why your discomfort is necessary and their comfort is unfortunate but unavoidable. And so life goes on, because of course it does. People still need bread, horses still need feeding, cloaks still need mending. Children still need to be told not to run too close to fires or wells or armed men, which in medieval towns was rather a broad category of danger. Merchants still count coins, even bad ones. Housewives still cut onions, wash linen, and worry about stores of flour. Students still argue. Priests still preach. Bells still ring. And beneath all of that ordinary living, another habit begins. Listening. Not listening in the soft way we mean it now, perhaps. Not listening for comfort, listening with hunger. Listening because someone has begun speaking in words that feel dangerously understandable. That mattered more than it might seem, because one of the strangest things about institutions is that they can survive almost anything except being translated into the language of ordinary resentment. Once that happens, once people begin hearing grand theological arguments in the same mind that also keeps track of rent, bread prices, insults, and unpaid labour, the distance between heaven and the street becomes unhelpfully small. And Prague, in those years, was full of these small shortenings of distance. The distance between clergy and laity, between Latin and Czech, between ritual and grievance, between what the church said it was and what people increasingly suspected it had become. None of this meant that everyone wanted revolution. That would be far too neat. Most people rarely want revolution in the abstract. Revolution is expensive, untidy, and very often involves sleeping badly. Most people want something more limited. They want relief. They want fairness, or what looks enough like fairness to allow supper to taste less bitter. They want abuses corrected, or at least brought slightly closer to the standards preached from pulpits. They want, in other words, a temporary solution. And temporary solutions are among the most dangerous things in history, because people almost never build them to remain temporary. They build them because they cannot bear the present arrangement one day longer. At first, that solution in Bohemia did not look like war. It looked like preaching. It looked like a chapel where the language was closer, clearer, less padded with distance. It looked like worship that sounded less imported and more lived in. It looked like the old Christian promise, stripped of its ornaments and handed back in a form ordinary people could taste without needing a clerk of heaven to translate it. That was the beginning of many later troubles, not because simplicity is inherently dangerous, but because once people are told that the truth is simple, they begin looking around for the men who have made it expensive. And there were many expensive men available. This is where a city begins to change in a way no one can fully measure while it is happening. A butcher hears one sermon, a widow hears another. A university student hears one version of reform and repeats it badly in a tavern. A craftsman hears the same idea and repeats it more angrily at home. A woman in the market hears fragments of all of it while buying onions and salt, and by evening those fragments have become an opinion. Not yet a program, not yet a faction, just an opinion. But opinions, if left in enough kitchens and workshops, begin breeding. That was the trouble with Prague. It was full of places where words could sit for a while. Workshops, alehouses, church porches, doorways, the edges of markets, bridges where people paused, courtyards where laundry snapped in the wind and people spoke while pretending not to gossip. A city is a marvelous machine for turning sermons into rumour and rumour into conviction. It takes very little, just enough repetition, just enough insult, just enough visible hypocrisy. Soon, even those who cannot quote any doctrine begin feeling with enormous certainty that something is wrong. And once that feeling becomes common, institutions begin to wobble, not collapse at once. That would be mercifully efficient. They wobble first, they creak, they produce arguments, they provoke statements, condemnations, and solemn letters from men who imagine that paragraphs can halt a shift already underway in the nerves of a population. Sometimes they can. Usually they cannot. Jan Hus did not create every grievance in Bohemia. That is one of the comforting lies people like to tell afterward, because it suggests that if one man had only remained quiet, everything might have continued as before. But things had already begun gathering. He gave them language, shape, and a moral edge. He allowed many people to believe that what irritated them spiritually and what burdened them materially belonged to the same diseased body. And that is a very intoxicating idea. Because if corruption is one body, then one cure might remove it. People adore one cure. They always have. One cure for bad clergy. One cure for unjust wealth. One cure for distant kings. One cure for moral rot. One cure for the old humiliations. It is rarely true, but it is wonderfully efficient as a fantasy. And Prague, by then, had a growing appetite for efficient fantasies. The church authorities, naturally, did what institutions often do when their authority begins slipping. They tried to regulate what people could say, sing, hear, and teach, which made perfect institutional sense and terrible human sense. Nothing fattens a forbidden idea like persecution that stops halfway. If you crush something immediately and absolutely, history becomes very ugly but administratively simple. If you condemn, threaten, delay, argue, punish selectively, and allow debate to leak through 100 cracks, then you create martyrs, half-martyrs, almost martyrs, admired troublemakers, and the delicious belief that powerful men are afraid of what ordinary people are hearing. That belief is rocket fuel. And now, everyday life begins changing in ways that are both small and enormous. A service sounds different. A hymn in Czech lands differently in the body than one heard but not entirely lived. The chalice begins to mean more than a vessel. A symbol slips out of the church and into the street, and once that happens, it becomes impossible to keep it tidy. That is another rule worth remembering. The moment a religious symbol becomes easy to draw, wear, carve, or carry, it belongs to politics as well. And politics is not known for cleanliness. The city starts dividing, though not with the honesty of clean lines. People imagine these things as if districts choose sides neatly, windows opening onto certainty. But real towns are ruder than that. One household leans one way, the next another. A father prefers moderation, a son wants zeal, an apprentice repeats whatever the loudest man in the room said yesterday, and a wife quietly keeps track of which priest seems holier and which one merely better fed. New town grows more restless. Old town more cautious. Churches become places where doctrine is heard and measured, yes, but also places where one notes who is present, who is absent, who receives, who refuses, who sings with confidence, who lowers their eyes, who might be with you, who might someday denounce you. It becomes difficult to attend worship innocently, which is a remarkable achievement for any society. There is also money, of course. There is always money. One should never trust a historical crisis that tries to arrive wearing only theology. Somewhere beneath the vestments, there is almost always a purse. Coinage had worsened. Trade had suffered. Royal power did not inspire confidence. Bad money passed from hand to hand with the special insult of being both necessary and suspicious. A labourer paid in poor coin is not merely underpaid. He is invited to participate in the lie. He must accept what everyone knows has diminished and behave as though the old value still clings to it. This is exhausting. And people who are exhausted by lies become strangely receptive to men who speak of purity. Not because purity is practical, it usually is not, but because after living among little cheats, little falsities, little evasions, the promise of something clean becomes emotionally irresistible. That is how ordinary life bends toward extremity without fully noticing the turn. A person does not wake one morning and decide with theatrical clarity to live inside a revolution. A person wakes, dresses, eats something thin, hears another sermon, handles another bad coin, remembers another arrogance, and eventually finds that the old arrangement has become intolerable. Not in theory, in the hands, in the stomach, in the ear, and all the while, temporary fixes keep presenting themselves. Let the preaching be freer. Let the worship be simpler. Let the language be clearer. Let the clergy own less. Let the people receive more fully. Let corruption be corrected. Let sin be punished properly. Just this, and order will return. Just this, and the city will quiet. Just this, and God will be less offended. Just this. History is built from those two words more often than people admit. Just this tax. Just this reform. Just this confiscation. Just this emergency court, just this temporary militia, just this cart placed across the road until matters settle down. And of course, they never settle down. By the time crowds begin moving through streets with more purpose than custom, by the time processions feel like rehearsals for something sharper, by the time authority answers unrest with indignation instead of intelligence, the old city has already begun disappearing. Not physically at first. Its stones remain, its bridges remain, its roofs, ovens, inns, workshops, monasteries, courtyards, pig yards, drains, towers, and church doors remain. But the ordinary assumptions have gone thin, and a city cannot live long on thin assumptions. People become careful with strangers, careless with enemies, brave in groups, trembling alone. They hear bells differently. They watch windows. They notice whether the council seems firm or hesitant. They discuss kings by name with a familiarity that would have seemed dangerous not long ago. This is another quiet sign that old obedience is loosening, when ordinary people begin talking about rulers not as distant facts, but as men who might be judged. And judged they were. King Wenceslas was not a sturdy answer to crisis. Sigismund, looming behind future claims, was to many no answer at all, or a deeply offensive one. The high politics of dynasty pressed down upon the lower politics of grievance, and the pressure only made the city more volatile. Because now the question was no longer simply whether the church should be reformed, or worship altered, or preaching expanded. Now the question became, who would rule a kingdom in which so many no longer trusted the old terms of obedience? That is when cities begin producing scenes later remembered as turning points. But even turning points do not feel like turning points while you are inside them. They feel crowded, noisy, sweaty, confused, full of elbows and shouted words and contradictory rumours and the unpleasant realization that no one seems to know how far things are going to go. One procession, one confrontation, one set of officials in a town hall, one burst of force, one window, and suddenly what had felt like pressure becomes event. The defenestration, like many famous political acts, was both shocking and entirely in character for a society that had spent years moving grievances closer to the body. If institutions no longer command reverence, eventually they stop being abstract. Then men become simply men. Councillors become merely reachable. Windows become opportunities. A city that throws officials from a building has crossed a threshold, though not necessarily into clarity. That is another disappointment history offers regularly. Violence clarifies loyalty less than people expect. It reveals energy, yes. It reveals thresholds crossed, yes. But it does not immediately solve the arguments underneath. In some ways it worsens them, because now every problem has blood attached to it, and blood is notoriously bad at calming committees. Wenceslas dies not long after, and the kingdom is left with grief in some quarters, relief in others, and uncertainty almost everywhere. The old framework loosens further. Sigismund stands as heir, but to many Hussites he is unacceptable, not merely inconvenient, unacceptable. That difference matters. An inconvenient ruler may be bargained with. An unacceptable ruler invites preparation, and preparation, at first, still looks temporary. A town strengthens its watches. A road is observed. Weapons are gathered. Not elegant weapons, perhaps. Not the polished emblems of knightly glory. More the practical sort. What is at hand? What can be lifted? What can strike? What can frighten horsemen who have spent their lives assuming that lesser people will scatter? Carts matter more. Tools matter more. Men who know wood and iron matter more. This too begins almost innocently. A wagon is a wagon. It carries grain, barrels, cloth, household goods, and sometimes families. It creaks, breaks an axle, requires repair, absorbs mud, annoys horses, and occupies more road than everyone else would like. No one looks at an ordinary wagon and says, "There, at last, the future of military history." That would be absurd, and yet absurdity is constantly entering history through useful objects. When a society does not have enough of the glamorous thing, it becomes intimate with the practical thing. If heavy cavalry belongs to nobles, then common people begin thinking very hard about terrain, barriers, angles, wheels, chains, ditches, poles, firearms, and how to survive a charge from men who believe God invented horses mainly to elevate their social rank. Improvisation begins there, not from confidence, but from shortage, not from doctrine, but from necessity. A wagon can carry supplies. A wagon can block a road. A wagon can shield frightened men long enough for frightened men to become dangerous. A wagon can buy time. And time, in war, is one of the few things that reliably turns the weak into a problem. That insight did not arrive fully dressed. It came in pieces, as useful truths usually do. Put the carts here, chain them there, leave a gap, close it, fire from behind, hold, wait. Let the horsemen come on. Let them discover that the world has become less convenient than they expected. A temporary arrangement, just for now, just until this crisis passes, just until the enemy is gone, just until order is restored. And there it is again, just this. The city was learning to carry its fear in wooden shapes, to move anxiety on wheels, to turn transport into shelter, shelter into defense, defense into method. A thing built for carrying grain would begin carrying a revolution, and no one, at first, would admit how permanent such inventions can become. Because once a people discover that an improvised answer works, they rarely surrender it willingly, not even when peace returns, especially not when peace does not. For now, though, the streets are still streets. The bells still ring. Women still carry baskets. Men still curse at muddy wheels. Priests still preach. Coins still disappoint. And somewhere in all that ordinary life, a kingdom is beginning to arrange itself around the possibility that carts, songs, anger, and sacrament might together become stronger than old obedience, which is not the sort of thought a city enjoys having, but Prague was already having it. And once a city begins thinking like that, sleep becomes difficult. There is something very ordinary about a cup. It does not threaten anyone. It does not demand attention. It simply sits there, waiting to be filled, passed, emptied, and set aside again. And for a very long time, that is exactly what it was. A vessel, a small, practical object, obedient to the hands that held it. It belonged to ritual, yes, but it behaved like all other objects, useful, replaceable, forgettable, once its task was done, which is precisely why it became dangerous. Because objects that look harmless are the easiest to move. And once they begin to move, they begin to change. At first, nothing seems different. A service continues. A priest stands where he has always stood. Words are spoken that have been spoken before, with the same careful cadence, the same familiar rhythm that lulls the mind into acceptance. People kneel, people rise, people wait. But then there is a small alteration. Not a grand proclamation, not a thunderous reform, just a gesture that feels, at first, almost like a correction. The cup is offered. not only to the priest, but to the people, and for a moment nothing explodes. No walls crack, no heavens split open. The world continues with its quiet stubbornness. But inside that moment, something has shifted in a way that is difficult to reverse. Because a person who receives something once begins to ask, very quietly at first, why it was ever withheld. And that question does not stay quiet for long. It follows them home. It sits with them at the table. It lingers while they work. It returns when they hear sermons. It becomes one of those small, persistent irritations that refuses to dissolve. Why not before? Why not always? Why only now? And most dangerously of all, who decided? The cup, which had once belonged to the structure of the church, begins to slip, not physically, symbolically. It becomes something that can be understood without permission, something that can be desired without explanation, something that can be defended without needing Latin. And that is when it leaves the altar, not entirely, not officially, but in the imagination, in the way people begin to think about it, to talk about it, to expect it. It becomes portable, not in the hand, but in the mind. And once something is portable in the mind, it does not stay where it was placed. It begins appearing in conversations, in arguments, in places it was never meant to go. A craftsman speaks of it as fairness. A widow speaks of it as dignity. A student speaks of it as truth. A priest speaks of it as reform. A radical speaks of it as proof that everything else is wrong. And now the problem begins, because the cup was never designed to carry all of that. It was meant to carry wine. It was not meant to carry resentment, hope, accusation, and expectation all at once. But now it does. And objects that carry too much meaning tend to break things, not themselves, everything around them. People begin to draw it, carve it, mark it, repeat it. It appears in places where symbols are not usually welcome, on walls, on banners, in the margins of texts, in conversations that begin as something else and end inevitably with the same quiet insistence. We should receive it. We should all receive it. And again, it sounds reasonable, almost modest, almost humble, which is exactly what makes it impossible to contain. Because when a demand feels modest, resistance feels excessive. And when resistance feels excessive, it becomes suspect. And when authority becomes suspect, obedience becomes optional. This is how a small change in ritual begins to unthread an entire structure. Not quickly, not cleanly, slowly, annoyingly, in ways that feel, at each step, completely manageable. Just this. Just allow it. Just adjust. Just correct. Just return to something purer. The words are always gentle at first. They always are. But the reactions are not, because institutions do not like being adjusted from below. They prefer to adjust themselves slowly, ceremonially, with proper language and controlled timing. They do not appreciate being nudged by people who smell like workshops and kitchens, and so they respond, not always with violence. At least not immediately. They respond with argument, with prohibition, with clarification, with lines drawn more sharply than before. No, not like this. Not now. Not by you. Which is, of course, exactly the wrong answer. Because once a thing has been experienced, denial feels less like protection and more like theft. And people do not respond well to feeling that something has been taken from them, even if, strictly speaking, it had never been theirs before. That detail rarely matters. Experience rewrites ownership very quickly. And so now the cup is no longer a cup. It is a claim, a quiet, persistent claim that something has been wrong for a long time. And claims, once made, are very difficult to unmake, especially when they begin to overlap. Because the cup does not remain alone, it gathers companions. Preaching should be freer. The church should be poorer. Sin should be punished properly, not selectively, not politely, properly. These ideas begin to travel together, not because they are identical, but because they feel like they belong to the same dissatisfaction. And people are very good at grouping their frustrations. It saves time, it simplifies anger, and it creates the illusion that a single correction might fix multiple problems, which, again, is rarely true, but extremely attractive. So now, in Prague and beyond, something new exists. Not quite a unified movement, not quite chaos, something in between, a shared discomfort, a shared set of ideas that do not yet fully agree with each other, but agree enough to recognize a common enemy. And that is often sufficient, at least in the beginning, because enemies are easier to define than solutions. You can point to corruption, you can point to wealth, you can point to hypocrisy, you can point to distant authority, but when it comes time to build something new, suddenly the agreement begins to thin. But we are not there yet. For now, the energy is still outward, still focused, still gathering, and in that gathering, something else begins to form. Groups, not formal ones, not yet, just clusters. People who attend the same sermons, people who trust the same voices, people who begin to recognize each other not by name but by inclination. You can see it in how they stand, how they speak, how quickly they agree, how slowly they doubt. These are the early shapes of factions, and factions do not require organization to exist. They require alignment, a shared sense of what feels right and what feels intolerable. Prague begins to fill with these alignments, some cautious, some fervent, some confused, some very certain, too certain, always a worrying sign. And as these alignments grow, so does the need to act, because ideas that remain only ideas begin to feel insufficient. They demand expression, and expression, in crowded cities, tends to become public. Processions, gatherings, demonstrations of belief, visible, audible, undeniable. And once belief becomes visible, it becomes measurable. Who joins? Who hesitates? Who refuses? Who watches? Who reports? Because there are always people watching, always people who benefit from noticing, and always people who are afraid not to notice. So the city becomes louder, not just in sound. In intention, movements feel heavier, words feel sharper, silence feels suspicious. And still, everything insists it is temporary. Just this pressure, just this correction, just this moment. It will pass. It always passes. Cities tell themselves this often, right up until the moment when passing becomes impossible. Because now the alignments begin to harden. The cup is no longer just desired. It is expected. Preaching is no longer just appreciated. It is demanded. Corruption is no longer just criticized. It must be punished. And punishment is where things begin to lose their balance. Because punishment requires decision. Who decides? On what authority? By what standard? And once those questions enter a movement that is already questioning authority, they do not resolve themselves politely. They multiply and multiply and multiply until every answer creates two more questions. And every attempt at order produces new disorder. This is where people begin improvising more aggressively. If authority is unclear, then authority must be created. If structures are failing, then new structures must be attempted. If enforcement is inconsistent, then enforcement must become visible. And visible enforcement is rarely gentle. Crowds begin to take on roles they were not designed for. Judges, enforcers, witnesses, participants, all at once. And this, more than anything, changes the atmosphere of a city. Because a crowd that believes it is correcting injustice behaves very differently from a crowd that is merely complaining. It becomes purposeful, and purpose, when shared, is a powerful accelerant, especially when it is tied to belief, especially when it is tied to God. Because once people begin to believe that their actions are not merely justified, but necessary in a divine sense, restraint becomes negotiable, and negotiation in crowded streets is not known for its patience. The moment comes, as it always does, when tension seeks a release, not planned, not coordinated in the way later historians prefer, just a convergence, a procession, a confrontation, voices raised, authority challenged, and then action, sudden, irreversible, men thrown from a window. It is such a strange, specific act, and yet it feels inevitable once it happens, because it fits. Not logically, emotionally, it is what a crowd does when it has stopped believing that the people above it are untouchable, and in that moment, something collapses. Not just bodies, a boundary, a distance. The idea that authority exists somewhere out of reach. Now it is reachable. Now it is vulnerable. Now it can fall. And once that is known, it cannot be unknown. The city does not return to what it was. It cannot. Even if the buildings remain, even if the routines try to continue, even if people still wake, eat, work, and sleep, something fundamental has shifted. Authority has lost its height. And when authority loses its height, everything begins to rearrange itself, slowly, unevenly, uncomfortably, because now the question is no longer whether change is possible. That has been answered. The question is how far it will go, and no one, not even the most confident voices in the streets, truly knows the answer, which is perhaps the most dangerous condition a society can enter. Confidence without clarity, action without agreement, belief without limit, and all of it still dressed outwardly as something temporary. Just this, just a correction, just a necessary act, just one step. But steps, once taken, have a habit of leading somewhere, even if no one planned the path, even if no one agrees on the destination, even if the original intention has already begun to blur. And in Prague, by now, it was already blurring. The cup had travelled. The crowd had acted. The city had crossed a line it could not see, but could definitely feel. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the fields, beyond the comfortable assumption that this was still a local disturbance, others were beginning to notice, and they were not pleased. There is a moment in almost every collapsing order when someone suggests something very reasonable, not grand, not impossible, just cleaner. If everything is corrupted, they say, then perhaps we should begin again, not repair, not adjust. Begin again? It sounds sensible when spoken slowly, almost peaceful, as if one could step out of a troubled house, close the door behind it, and build another nearby with better walls, straighter beams, and fewer unpleasant memories tucked into the corners. And for a while, people believe this is possible. They always do. So they leave. Or they are pushed. Or they drift toward places where the air feels less compromised, where the sermons feel sharper, the expectations clearer, the purpose more direct. And somewhere beyond the dense, arguing streets of Prague, such a place begins to take shape. Not a city in the old sense. Not grown, not inherited, chosen, named deliberately, Tabor. A place that is not supposed to be what came before, which is already an enormous burden for any settlement. Because places rarely enjoy being told what they must represent. But Tabor did not have the luxury of reluctance. It was built from urgency, from conviction, from the quiet, dangerous belief that if enough things are stripped away, something pure might remain. At first, this looks like relief. No old hierarchies, no inherited privileges, no excessive wealth displayed in the open, no long chains of command stretching upward into distant authorities who do not listen. Just people, together, equal, or at least closer to equal than they had been. It is a beautiful idea, and like many beautiful ideas, it is immediately complicated by the presence of other people, because people, unfortunately, bring themselves with them wherever they go. Their habits, their expectations, their small vanities, their fears, their need to be heard, their need to be right, their suspicion that someone else might already be more important than they are, even in a place that claims to have abandoned importance, especially there. Still, for a time, the illusion holds. Property is gathered, not owned in the old sense, placed into common stores, collected in ways that feel almost ceremonial, a kind of offering, not to a lord, not to a bishop, but to the community itself, which, in theory, is everyone. In practice, it is slightly less simple, because once things are gathered, they must be sorted. And once they are sorted, they must be distributed. And once they are distributed, someone must decide how that distribution works. And once someone decides, they have become something very familiar. Authority, even if no one calls it that, even if they try very hard not to, even if they invent new names, softer names, names that suggest service rather than control. Clerks, helpers, organizers, keepers. The names change. The function does not. Someone must stand near the tubs of goods and determine who receives what. Someone must decide which needs are urgent, which are less so, which can wait, which cannot. And suddenly, the clean beginning is no longer quite so clean, because fairness, when imagined, is simple. When practiced, it becomes intricate, contested, and occasionally exhausting. Still, it continues, because the alternative is worse. And besides, this is temporary, just until things settle, just until the old corruption is fully removed, just until the world outside catches up, just until, always just until, the language of temporary solutions settles over Tabor like a second roof. Everything is provisional. Everything is necessary. Everything is explained as part of a process that will, eventually, lead to something stable. But stability has a way of avoiding places that keep rearranging themselves, especially when those places are also preparing for war. Because Tabor is not only a social experiment, it is a preparation, a gathering, a sharpening. People do not come here only to live differently. They come here because they expect to fight. And fighting, unfortunately, requires things that do not align easily with equality. Weapons, command, discipline, speed, obedience. Not the slow, thoughtful obedience of moral agreement. The fast, unquestioning kind the kind that keeps people alive when something large and dangerous is moving toward them. This is where the second layer of improvisation begins, because the same people who have rejected hierarchy must now build it. Carefully, reluctantly, but unmistakably, someone must lead. Someone must decide when to move, when to hold, when to strike, when to retreat. And those decisions cannot be voted on in the middle of a charge. So leadership appears, not always gracefully, not always uncontested, but inevitably, and once it appears, it begins to settle into place, even if everyone insists it is temporary, even if everyone promises it will be undone later. Later has a way of becoming distant, especially when survival keeps interrupting. Meanwhile, life continues inside this new structure, strangely familiar, strangely altered. People still wake, still eat, still argue, still work. But now the rhythms are tighter, more intentional, more watched, because this is not just a place to live. It is a place to prove something. And proving things tends to make people behave in ways that are both admirable and exhausting. There is less patience for deviation, less tolerance for ambiguity, more interest in who is committed, who is pure, who is reliable, which, again, sounds reasonable. Until one considers how often those judgments are wrong, or influenced, or quietly shaped by personal irritation rather than genuine concern. But such considerations rarely slow movements that believe themselves to be correcting the world. If anything, they accelerate them, because doubt begins to feel like betrayal. And betrayal, in a place already under pressure, is not treated gently. So discipline grows, not only in the military sense, in the social sense, in the moral sense, in the everyday sense. What people wear, what they say, how they behave, what they keep, what they surrender, all of it begins to matter more than it did before. Because now every action is part of something larger, a test, a demonstration, a contribution, or a failure. And no one wants to be the failure, especially not in a place that has promised to be better. Better places are very hard to live in. They expect more. They notice more. They forgive less. Still, Taba holds. And as it holds, it becomes something else. Not just a refuge, a model, or at least it begins to look like one from the outside, which is always slightly misleading, because models look simpler at a distance, more coherent, more intentional. From within, they are full of adjustments, corrections, small compromises that are explained as necessary, and sometimes forgotten entirely. But from the outside, it appears as though something new has been created, something that rejects the old order, something that might spread, and that possibility is deeply unsettling, not only to kings and bishops, but to those within the broader Hussite movement who are not entirely comfortable with how far things are going. Because while Tabor is experimenting, Prague is still negotiating, still balancing, still trying, in its own way, to hold on to parts of the old structure while adjusting others. And now the difference between them becomes visible, uncomfortably visible. One side says, we should reform. The other begins to say, we should replace. And those are not the same conversation at all. So the movement begins to split, not cleanly, not officially, but in tone, in expectation, in what feels acceptable, in what feels necessary. And once that split exists, even quietly, it begins to widen, because every decision now carries an additional weight. Not only is it right or wrong, it belongs to one side or the other, which makes compromise more difficult, because compromise begins to look like betrayal from both directions. And still, outside forces gather. Still, pressure builds. Still, the need to act increases. And in that pressure, another improvised solution begins to take shape. Less philosophical, more practical, less about how to live, more about how to survive. Because whatever Tabor is trying to become, it will not exist for long if it cannot defend itself. And defense, like everything else, begins simply. A wagon, just a wagon, wooden, heavy, annoying to maneuver, useful for carrying goods, useless, it would seem, against armoured men on horseback, except not entirely, because if you place it here and another there, and you connect them, and you stand behind them, and you wait, something interesting happens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably, the charge slows, the angle changes, the expectation breaks. The rider, who has spent a lifetime moving forward, suddenly meets something that refuses to move. And in that hesitation, that brief, precious hesitation, everything begins to change. This is not a grand invention. No one stands up and declares a new system of warfare. No treatise is written in that moment. It is simply an adjustment, a practical response to a practical problem. We do not have what they have. So we will use what we do. Just this. Just for now. Just until we can manage something better. But better does not always arrive. Sometimes the temporary solution proves sufficient. More than sufficient. It proves effective. And effectiveness is very persuasive, especially in war, because war is not interested in elegance. It is interested in results. If something works, it is kept. If it works again, it is trusted. If it works repeatedly, it becomes doctrine. And so the wagon changes. Not physically, it is still wood, still creaks, still breaks, still requires repair, still irritates the men who must push it. But now it carries something else. Expectation, strategy, confidence, and once those settle into it, it is no longer just a tool. It is a system, a moving wall, a portable refusal, a way of saying, you will not pass easily, and saying it in a language that does not require translation. Because even the most confident cavalryman understands resistance when he meets it directly. The beauty of it, if one can use that word carefully, is that it requires very little of what the Hussites lack. It does not require noble birth. It does not require lifelong training. It does not require expensive equipment. It requires coordination, position, timing, and a willingness to stand behind something simple and trust it, which, in its own way, mirrors everything else that is happening. A simple idea, placed carefully, held together, tested, repeated, and slowly becoming permanent. Even as everyone insists it is temporary, even as they say, just for now, just until, just this. And now, with Tabor forming, with factions beginning to harden, with wagons becoming more than wagons, with belief tightening into expectation, the movement is no longer something that can be dismissed. It is no longer a disturbance. It is no longer a correction. It is something else. Something that has weight, structure, momentum. And somewhere beyond Bohemia, that weight is being measured. That structure is being watched. That momentum is being feared. Because now the question is no longer whether this will continue. It is who will try to stop it, and how badly they will fail. There is a certain kind of confidence that belongs to men who have rarely been surprised. It is not loud. It does not need to be. It sits comfortably in posture, in the way a man holds his shoulders, in the way he mounts a horse without looking down, in the way he assumes that the world, broadly speaking, will behave as it has behaved before. Armies carry this kind of confidence, especially armies that have been winning, or at least not losing in any memorable way, especially armies made of men who have spent their lives being told by birth, by training, by armour, by history that they are meant to prevail. It becomes less a belief and more a background condition, like breathing, and so, when the first crusading forces begin to gather, there is very little doubt about what will happen, not in their minds. This is, after all, a correction, a necessary one. A troublesome region has wandered too far. A group of people has misunderstood something important. It happens. It has happened before. It will be resolved. That is the expectation. It feels orderly. It feels familiar. It feels like something that has already been solved many times. And perhaps that is the problem, because expectation, when it becomes too comfortable, stops asking useful questions. It does not wonder what has changed. It does not look too closely at the details. It does not consider that the opponent might not behave correctly. Correctly, in this case, meaning as expected. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, expectation is doing something very different. It is shrinking, narrowing, becoming practical, less concerned with how things should be, more concerned with how things are and how to survive them. This produces a different kind of confidence, not the quiet, inherited kind, a sharper one, more alert, less comfortable, the kind that watches carefully because it has to, because being wrong carries immediate consequences. And so, when these two forms of confidence meet, one relaxed, one tense, something interesting begins to happen. Not immediately. At first, it looks like every other encounter. Forces gather, standards are raised, orders are given, men move into position, armour glints, horses shift, there is weight, there is presence, there is the reassuring sense that everything is proceeding as it should. And then it does not. Not quite. Because the field is not arranged as expected, the approach feels inconvenient. There are obstacles, not natural ones, placed ones, deliberate, annoying, wagons, more wagons than there should be, in positions that feel less like transport and more like intention. And for a moment, this is merely irritating, an obstacle, something to be cleared, something to be moved through, because that is what cavalry does. It moves through, it breaks, it disperses, it does not stop, it does not hesitate, except it does, just a little, not enough to call it failure, not enough to admit that something is wrong, just enough to disturb the rhythm. And rhythm in war is everything, because once the rhythm breaks, even slightly, everything else begins to shift. The timing, the spacing, the confidence, the assumptions, the understanding of what comes next. And suddenly, the familiar sequence is no longer reliable. The charge slows, not dramatically, just enough. The angle narrows. The horses feel it. The men feel it. And behind the wagons, there are people, not arranged like professional soldiers, not moving like trained formations, but positioned, prepared, waiting, which is not what they were supposed to be doing. They were supposed to break, scatter, run. That is how this works. That is how it has always worked. Except now it does not. The first moments of confusion are small. They always are. A hesitation, a missed step, a delayed command, a man looking slightly longer than he should, a horse pulling back when it should press forward. Nothing catastrophic, just wrong. And wrong, when repeated, becomes something else. It becomes pattern. And pattern, when recognized too late, becomes problem. Because now the wagons are not just obstacles, they are positions. And positions, once established, are difficult to remove without time. And time is exactly what the Hussites have been trying to buy. Not victory, at first. Time. Time to hold. Time to adjust. Time to turn fear into something more useful. And now they have it. Not much. Just enough. Which, again, is often all that is required. From behind the wooden line, something else begins to emerge. Sound. Sharp. Unfamiliar. Not the clash of blade against blade. Not the thud of impact. Something smaller, more contained, but repeated, persistent. Firearms. Not elegant ones. Not precise. Not particularly reliable, but present. And presence, again, is enough. Because this is not what the attackers prepared for. This is not what they expected to meet. And expectation, once broken, is very difficult to rebuild in the middle of action. Men begin to adjust. They always do. But adjustment takes time. And time, here, is being used by the other side. Carefully, deliberately, not rushed, not wasted. The wagons hold. The line holds. The noise continues. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the advantage shifts. Not completely, not decisively, but enough. Enough to change the tone. Enough to introduce doubt. Enough to make confidence less comfortable. And that is where things begin to unravel. Not dramatically, not all at once. Gradually, the way confidence leaves a room, quietly, one person at a time. A man withdraws slightly, another follows. A command is given, then reconsidered. A push becomes a pause. A pause becomes uncertainty, and uncertainty, in the presence of resistance, becomes retreat. Not a full retreat. Not yet. Just a step. Just a correction. Just until the situation is clearer. Just until order is restored. Just until, again, always again. And now, the roles begin to reverse. The defenders, who were supposed to endure, begin to press. Carefully, not wildly, not recklessly, but with a growing understanding that what they are doing is working. And working changes everything. Because once something works, it invites repetition. And repetition creates confidence. Not inherited confidence, earned confidence, which tends to be more aggressive, less patient, more willing to test itself again and again and again. This is how a temporary method becomes habit. How habit becomes expectation. How expectation becomes identity. We fight like this. We win like this. We hold like this. And once that identity forms, it does not dissolve easily, even if circumstances change, even if better options appear, even if the original necessity disappears. Because success has a way of hardening into belief, and belief resists change. So the wagons remain, the formations tighten, the methods refine, not through theory, through repetition, through survival, through the simple, undeniable fact that they keep working. And meanwhile, on the other side, something else is happening. Adjustment, but slower, more reluctant. Because admitting that something new is required means admitting that something old is no longer sufficient. And that is not an easy admission for men who have built their lives on the sufficiency of what they know, so they try again and again, each time expecting a different result, each time surprised when the field behaves the same way, because the field has changed, not physically. Structurally, the rules have shifted, quietly, without permission, and now those who do not adapt are the ones who hesitate. And hesitation, as we have seen, is expensive. The Crusades continue. More forces, more attempts, more confidence carried across borders with the expectation that weight alone will resolve the problem. But weight without understanding is awkward, heavy, slow, predictable, and predictability in the presence of an opponent who has learned to improvise becomes a weakness, one that is noticed, used, repeated, and so the pattern settles. Attempts are made. They fail. Adjustments are promised. They arrive too late. Confidence returns. It is tested. It breaks again. And each time this happens, something else grows. Not just within Bohemia, outside it. Fear, not immediate fear, not panic. Something slower, more uncomfortable. The realization that this is not resolving, that this is not correcting itself, that something smaller, less formal, less structured, is repeatedly resisting something larger, and that should not be happening, which makes it all the more disturbing that it is. And now the question changes, quietly at first, then more openly. Not, how do we defeat them? But, why are we not defeating them? And that question lingers, because it has no simple answer. There are many answers, none satisfying, all inconvenient, which means they are often ignored, at least for a while, until ignoring them becomes impossible, until the pattern is too clear, too repeated, too undeniable, and by then, something else has already happened. The temporary solution has become the system. The improvisation has become the expectation. The people who were supposed to endure have learned how to resist. And the people who were supposed to win have learned, slowly, reluctantly, that they might not. There is a difference between surviving and not losing. It is a small difference at first, almost unnoticeable, a matter of wording, a matter of tone, but over time it becomes something else entirely. Survival is defensive. It is patient. It is careful. It measures success in absence. We are still here. We have not been broken. We endured. Not losing, on the other hand, is more ambitious. It carries a quiet implication. We should not be losing. We do not lose. And once that thought begins to settle into a group of people, something shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, because the mind begins to reorganize itself around expectation, and expectation, once established, begins to push outward. This is where the Hussites begin to change, not all at once, not by declaration, but by accumulation, victory after victory that does not quite feel like victory at the time, just another survival, just another defense, just another moment where they held. But holding, repeated enough times, becomes something else. It becomes evidence. And evidence, when shared among many people, becomes belief. And belief, well, belief is rarely content to remain still. At first, they still speak the language of defense. They still describe themselves as protectors, guardians of what is right, resisting what is wrong. It sounds modest. It sounds justified. It sounds contained. But inside that language, something else is growing. A question, a quiet one. If we can hold, why do we not move? If we can resist, why do we not press? If we can survive, why do we not change what surrounds us? And once that question appears, it does not leave. It lingers, it returns, it waits for the right moment. And the right moment, as it turns out, arrives not through planning, but through familiarity, because by now the Hussites are familiar with something that their enemies are not. Success, not in the grand ceremonial sense, not in the way kings celebrate, in the practical sense. We tried this. It worked. We did it again. It worked again. We expected it to fail. It did not. And this repetition begins to create a new kind of confidence, not inherited, not assumed, tested, which makes it more dangerous, because tested confidence does not ask permission. It does not wait for approval. It moves. And so, slowly, almost reluctantly at first, they begin to move, not far, not boldly, just beyond what is necessary, just enough to see what happens. A raid, a movement outward, a step beyond the line that had once been so carefully defended. And when nothing catastrophic happens, when the world does not collapse, when the enemy does not immediately restore order, that step becomes something else, an option. And options, once discovered, tend to multiply. Soon, it is no longer just one movement. It is several, not coordinated in the grand sense, not unified, but similar, repeated, carried out with a growing understanding that the outside world is not as stable as it once appeared, that it can be touched, entered, disturbed, and this changes everything. Because now the war is no longer something that happens to them. It becomes something they carry outward, which is a very different posture, a very different psychology, and a very different problem for everyone. Because the moment a group that was defined by defense begins to act offensively, its identity begins to blur. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually. And that blur introduces tension within, between, among. Some feel it, quietly, uneasily. This is not what we began as. This is not what we said we were doing. This is not. But the words fade. Because the results are difficult to argue with, the raids succeed, not always cleanly, not always without loss, but often enough, and often enough is all that is required to continue. And so they do. They move farther, more confidently, less cautiously. They begin to enter lands that had once looked distant, hostile, untouchable. Now they are reachable. Now they are vulnerable. Now they are opportunities, which is a dangerous word. Opportunity, because it rarely arrives alone. It brings with it justification, expansion, repetition, and eventually habit. And habit, once formed, becomes difficult to question, especially when it is reinforced by success. This is where the tone changes. Subtly, but unmistakably, the same wagons, the same formations, the same methods, but now used not to hold ground, but to take it, not to resist, but to impose. And the irony is not lost on those who are paying attention, though not everyone is, because attention is a limited resource, and in times of momentum, it is often directed outward, not inward. So the movement continues, and as it continues, it gathers something new. Reputation, not the kind one chooses, the kind that arrives from stories, from reports, from frightened descriptions carried from one place to another. They are coming, they are organized, they do not break. They do not behave as expected. They burn, they take, they move again. These stories spread faster than armies. They arrive before the Hussites do, and they prepare the ground in a very particular way. By emptying it, villages abandoned, towns closed, defences hastily assembled, or not assembled at all, because fear has a way of simplifying decisions. Leave, hide, avoid. And avoidance, repeated, becomes another kind of advantage, because resistance that never forms cannot succeed. And so, in some places, the Hussites arrived to find not opposition, but absence, which is a different kind of victory, quieter, less dramatic, but equally effective and equally dangerous, because it reinforces the same belief. This works. We can do this. We should continue. And so they do. Again and again, the pattern settles. Movement outward, return, reorganize, repeat. And with each repetition, the temporary becomes more permanent. The exception becomes expectation. The hesitation disappears. And something else replaces it. Momentum. Momentum is one of the most difficult things to interrupt because it feeds itself. Each success justifies the next. Each movement makes the next easier. Each fear it creates reduces resistance elsewhere, and so it grows. Not always evenly, not always predictably, but steadily, until it becomes something that even those within it begin to struggle to control. Because momentum does not ask what should happen. It asks what can happen, and then it moves toward it. This is where internal tension begins to rise. Not loudly, not yet, but persistently, because not everyone agrees on what this movement has become. Some still see defense, others see opportunity, some see justice, others begin to see excess, some see necessity, others feel something closer to discomfort. But discomfort in the presence of success is easy to ignore for a while, until it is not, until it begins to interfere, until it begins to divide. And division in a movement that has relied on shared purpose is inconvenient at best, dangerous at worst. But we are not there yet. Not fully. For now, the outward motion continues. The raids continue. The reputation grows. The fear spreads. The systems hold. The wagons roll. And the people who once built these methods as temporary solutions begin to live inside them, not questioning, not adjusting, not reconsidering, because there is no immediate reason to. They are not losing, and not losing has become something more than survival. It has become identity, and identity, once formed, is very difficult to reshape, even when it needs to be, even when the cost begins to rise, even when the direction begins to blur, even when the original purpose becomes harder to recognize. Because by now, the war is no longer what it was. It has stretched, expanded, shifted. It has moved beyond Prague, beyond Tabor, beyond the early arguments about cups and sermons and fairness. Now it is something else, something larger, something heavier, something that carries its own momentum. And somewhere inside that movement, quietly, almost politely, a question is waiting, not yet asked loudly, not yet answered, but present, growing. If we can do this to others, what happens when we do it to each other? There is a particular kind of disagreement that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with raised voices. It does not begin with accusations. It begins, instead, with a pause. A small one, almost polite. A moment where someone does not respond as quickly as they once would have. a hesitation where agreement used to be immediate, and for a while no one names it, because naming it would make it real, and as long as it remains unnamed, it can be ignored, or at least delayed. This is how the division begins, not in declarations, in tone, in rhythm, in the subtle difference between people who once moved together and now move almost together, which is in many ways worse, because misalignment that is obvious can be addressed. Misalignment that is quiet tends to grow. And inside the Hussite movement, by now, there is a great deal of quiet, not silence. There are still sermons, still arguments, still discussions. But underneath all of it, something is no longer aligned. Some still speak of reform, carefully, measured, with the language of adjustment. They speak of returning things to their proper place, of correcting what has gone wrong, of preserving what can still be preserved. Others, less patient now, speak differently, not of correction, of replacement, not of restoring, of removing, not of improving the structure, of discarding it entirely. And these are not the same ideas, even if they share the same beginning, even if they once stood side by side. Because once a movement begins to move outward, once it begins to succeed, once it develops habits, those habits begin to define what feels acceptable. And what once felt radical begins to feel normal. And what once felt cautious begins to feel insufficient. And insufficiency is not a comfortable feeling, especially not in a movement that has learned how to win. So the language sharpens, not always in public, not always directly, but in private, in smaller gatherings, in conversations that are careful at first and then less so, in judgments that are not announced but understood. They are too soft, they are too slow, they are not committed enough, and from the other side, they are too extreme, too reckless, too far removed from what this was meant to be. And now the distance grows, not measured in miles, measured in expectation, in what each side believes should happen next. And the problem is, there is no next that satisfies both, because one side wants to settle and the other does not recognize settlement as an option. Not anymore, not after everything, not after the effort, the victories, the losses, the changes that cannot be undone. To stop now would feel like a kind of betrayal, and to continue would feel, to others, like something dangerously close to madness, which is an uncomfortable place for any movement to find itself, because now the enemy is no longer only outside, it is inside, not fully, not openly, but undeniably, and that changes everything, because it is much easier to fight someone who is clearly not you. It is far more difficult to confront someone who believes very sincerely that they are continuing what you began, but in a way you no longer recognize, or no longer accept. This is where the conversations begin to fail, not because people stop speaking, but because they stop hearing the same words are used. Reform, truth, justice, purity, but they no longer mean the same thing. And when words lose their shared meaning, agreement becomes almost impossible, because it appears on the surface that everyone is still aligned, but beneath that surface, they are not. So meetings are held, arguments are made, positions are explained, and for a time, there is still hope that this can be resolved, that clarity can be restored, that the movement can return to something unified. But unity, once stretched too far, does not return easily, especially when it has been built on temporary agreements. because those agreements were never meant to last this long. They were meant to hold just long enough, just until the immediate problem was solved, just until the pressure eased, just until, but the pressure never eased. It shifted, it moved, it returned in different forms, and now the temporary framework must carry a permanent weight, and it begins to strain, visibly, uncomfortably, until it is clear it will not hold, at least not as it is. So a new kind of preparation begins, quieter, more deliberate, less spoken, more assumed. Not preparation for battle against outsiders, preparation for something far more difficult, the possibility of turning inward, which no one wants to say aloud, because saying it would make it unavoidable, but avoiding it does not make it disappear. It simply allows it to grow, and grow it does, through small incidents, through disagreements that are not resolved, through actions that feel excessive, through responses that feel insufficient, through the slow accumulation of irritation that no longer has a clear direction. Because now, who is right? Who decides? Who leads? Who defines what this movement is? These questions, once directed outward, now turn inward, and they do not find easy answers, because each answer is contested. Each authority is questioned. Each decision is examined. And examination, when it becomes constant, begins to erode confidence. Not the loud confidence of victory, the quiet confidence of agreement. And without that, everything becomes more fragile. Still, outwardly, things continue. Operations, movements, raids, defences. The machinery of war does not stop simply because the people inside it are uncertain. In fact, it often continues more forcefully, as if motion itself might resolve the tension, as if continuing to act might prevent the need to decide, which works for a time until it does not, until the tension becomes too present, too unavoidable, too integrated into every action, until every decision carries not just tactical weight, but ideological weight. And that is a heavy burden for any movement, especially one built on improvisation, because improvisation thrives on flexibility, and ideological division demands rigidity, and those two do not coexist comfortably. So the lines begin to form, not officially, not yet, but clearly, if one knows where to look, and people do look, carefully, quietly, they notice who stands with whom, who speaks in agreement, who remains silent, who hesitates, who pushes, and gradually the movement that once drew its strength from shared purpose begins to reorganize itself around difference. And difference, when sharpened by experience and success, becomes something more dangerous. It becomes conviction, not the soft kind, the firm kind, the kind that does not bend easily, the kind that does not compromise, the kind that would rather break than yield. And once that kind of conviction appears on both sides, the outcome becomes less uncertain, not inevitable, but increasingly likely. Because when two groups believe with equal certainty that they are right, there are only so many ways that can resolve. Most of them are unpleasant, and so slowly, almost gently, the movement prepares to do something it never intended to do, something it once would have considered unthinkable, something that feels, even now, slightly unreal, to turn against itself, not as a choice, as a consequence of everything that came before, of every temporary solution that became permanent, of every adjustment that was never undone, of every success that was never fully understood, of every belief that grew stronger than the structure that held it. And now The structure is no longer holding. It is separating, piece by piece, group by group, idea by idea, until what once felt like one movement begins to feel like many. And many, when pressed together under strain, do not become stronger. They become unstable. And instability, when combined with experience, organization, and the memory of victory, does not fade quietly. It resolves. And resolution, in this case, will not come from outside. There is a moment in long conflicts when everything feels tired, not finished, not resolved, just tired. The kind of tired that settles into people slowly, without asking permission. It is there when they wake, there when they speak, there when they listen to arguments they have heard too many times before. The same words, the same convictions, the same certainty that no longer feels as solid as it once did. Because repetition, while powerful, also wears things down, even belief, especially belief that has been stretched. And by now, the Hussite world is stretched, pulled between what it was, what it became, and what it is supposed to be next. And no one, not even the most confident voices, can fully agree on what that next thing looks like, which is a problem, because movement without agreement eventually becomes directionless. And directionless movements do not stop. They collide. At first, the idea of confrontation still feels avoidable. Surely something can be arranged. Surely some understanding can be reached. Surely, but surely has been working very hard for a very long time, and it is beginning to show signs of exhaustion, because every attempt at agreement returns to the same place, the same differences, the same lines that cannot be softened without someone feeling that something essential has been lost. And that feeling, loss, is not easily accepted, not after everything, not after the years, the effort, the blood, the changes that cannot be undone. To compromise now would feel like stepping backward into something that no longer exists. And to continue without compromise would mean this, which still feels, even now, slightly unreal. Because how does a movement turn against itself and still believe it is right? Very carefully, very slowly, with justifications, with language that makes it feel necessary, not desired, never desired, necessary. We are preserving what matters. We are correcting what has gone too far. We are protecting the true path. We are, and the sentences begin to sound familiar, uncomfortably familiar, because they echo the same language that was once used against them. But now, the direction has changed, and the recognition is inconvenient. So it is set aside, because there is no time for reflection. There is only movement, preparation, positioning, the quiet, deliberate work of placing forces where they need to be, of arranging the field, of deciding who stands where, and with whom, which, by now, is no longer obvious, because the lines have shifted, not cleanly, not simply, but enough. Enough that former allies now face each other across space that feels far too small and far too familiar. The day itself does not arrive with ceremony, no great announcement, no moment where everyone pauses and acknowledges what is about to happen. It begins like many other days have begun, with movement, with positioning, with the quiet awareness that something important is about to occur, even if no one names it directly, because naming it would make it heavier, and it is already heavy enough. The field waits. Fields always do, indifferent, unaware of what they are about to hold, of the decisions that will be made upon them, of the things that will not be undone. Men take their places, not strangers, not unknown enemies, familiar shapes, familiar methods, familiar ways of standing, of preparing, of waiting, and that familiarity is perhaps the most unsettling part, because there are no surprises here, no unknown tactics, no unexpected behaviours. Each side knows, in a general sense, how the other will move, what they will try, what they will rely on, which removes one of the few uncertainties war usually provides, and replaces it with something else, recognition. And recognition, in this context, is deeply uncomfortable, because it is difficult to treat someone as entirely other when they move like you, think like you, fight like you. It requires a certain kind of adjustment, a narrowing of perspective, a focusing on difference, on what separates, rather than what connects, which is not difficult to do, but it is not effortless either. Still, it is done, because it must be. The formations take shape. Wagons again. Of course, they are no longer surprising, no longer innovative. They are expected, integrated, part of how this war is fought, which, in itself, is a kind of quiet irony. The same temporary solution, now shared, now mirrored, now turned against itself. The lines form, the space between them settles into tension, and for a moment, just a moment, there is still the possibility that something might interrupt this. A delay, a reconsideration, a sudden shift, but no such interruption arrives, because by now the movement has gone too far to turn back without breaking, and so it breaks, not suddenly, not explosively, but decisively. The engagement begins, and what follows is not chaos. Not immediately. It is structured, deliberate, careful, because both sides know what they are doing. They know the methods, the sequences, the expectations, and for a time it holds, balanced, tense, neither side yielding, neither side collapsing, which is, in some ways, worse than a quick resolution, because it prolongs the moment. It stretches it, forces everyone involved to remain inside it longer than they might wish. And in that stretch, something begins to shift, not in the obvious places, not in the front lines, in the perception, in the understanding of what is happening, because at some point it becomes clear this is not going to resolve cleanly. This is not going to end with one side simply stepping back. This is not temporary, and once that realization settles, the tone changes, subtly but completely, because now what was being avoided must be completed. What was being delayed must be decided, and decisions in this context are final. The movement tightens, the pressure increases, and then it gives. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in enough places, at the right moments, with the right consequences, and once it begins, it continues. Because collapse, like momentum, feeds itself. A line weakens, another follows. A position breaks, the structure shifts, and suddenly what had been balanced is no longer. What had been stable is now moving. What had been controlled is becoming something else. The details blur. They always do. In the middle of events like this, clarity becomes a luxury. What remains is sensation, movement, sound, the awareness that something irreversible is happening. And then it is over. Not entirely, not in every sense, but in the way that matters most. The question has been answered, not through agreement, through force, And the answer, once given, does not feel like resolution. It feels like absence, because something that existed before no longer does. Not physically. The people remain, the places remain, the structures in some form remain, but the idea, the shared sense of purpose that once held everything together, that is gone, and without it everything feels different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, simpler, more complicated, clearer, less certain, because now the movement has defined itself not by what it opposed, not by what it endured, but by what it was willing to do to itself. And that is a definition that does not fade easily. Even as the immediate consequences settle, even as the surviving structures begin to stabilize, even as agreements are made, compromises reached, arrangements formalized, the memory remains, quiet, persistent, uncomfortable, a reminder that temporary solutions, when extended too far, do not always collapse outward. Sometimes they collapse inward. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a long argument, not the calm kind, not the satisfying kind, something thinner, more careful, the kind of quiet where people are still listening for what might come next. Even when nothing is coming, even when everything that could be said has already been said. And yet, the expectation remains that something, somewhere, is still unfinished. That is the quiet that settles over Bohemia, not immediately, not cleanly, but gradually, as if the land itself is trying to remember what it felt like before all of this began, and finding that it cannot quite do so, because too many things have changed, too many adjustments have been made, too many temporary solutions have settled into place and refused to leave. At first, the idea of peace appears almost fragile, like something that might break if handled too directly. So it is approached carefully, through discussion, through negotiation, through long, patient attempts to say things in ways that can be accepted without fully agreeing, which is, in many ways, the essence of compromise. Not resolution, acceptance of what cannot be undone, of what cannot be reversed, of what must now be lived with. And so, agreements begin to take shape, not perfect ones, not satisfying ones, but workable, which, at this stage, is enough. The cup, that small, ordinary object that was never meant to travel so far, is now permitted. Not everywhere, not without condition, but enough. Enough that it can remain. Enough that it no longer needs to be fought for in the same way. And this is, in a quiet sense, a victory, not the kind that arrives with celebration, the kind that settles into practice, into routine, into something that simply exists, which is often how the most lasting changes take hold, not through triumph, through repetition. The church, too, remains, not as it was, but not entirely replaced, adjusted, reduced in some ways, retained in others, which is uncomfortable for those who wanted it gone, and insufficient for those who wanted it unchanged, but stable enough, just stable enough. And stability, after years of strain, feels like relief, even when it is imperfect, especially then. Land has changed hands. Wealth has moved. Structures have been altered, not all at once, not uniformly, but enough. Enough that the old arrangement cannot simply be restored. And so a new one emerges, not designed, not planned, accumulated, piece by piece, decision by decision, adjustment by adjustment, until it begins to feel normal, which is perhaps the strangest part. How quickly people learn to live inside what once felt impossible. How quickly the extraordinary becomes routine. How quickly the unacceptable becomes simply how things are. Because people are very good at continuing, at adapting, at finding ways to move forward even when the ground beneath them has changed shape. And so life resumes, or something like it. Markets reopen, work continues, people speak, trade, argue, pray, the same actions as before, but with different meanings, different assumptions, different understandings of what is allowed, what is expected, what is no longer questioned. The cup remains, the language remains, the memory remains, even if it is not always spoken, even if it is not always comfortable, especially then, because memory does not require attention to persist. It settles into habits, into reactions, into the small ways people respond to authority, to ritual, to each other. And those small ways matter more than declarations, more than agreements, more than documents, because documents can be forgotten. Habits remain, and this is where the most lasting change has occurred. Not in the outcome of battles, not in the formal agreements, in the habits, in the expectations, in the quiet understanding that things can be different, that authority can be questioned, that structures can be altered, that what once seemed permanent was not. And that realization does not fade easily, even when peace is declared, even when order is restored, even when life begins to resemble what it once was, because it is not the same. It cannot be. Too much has been seen, too much has been done, too many lines have been crossed. And lines, once crossed, are very difficult to redraw. Still, there is relief, of a kind. The fighting slows, then stops. Not everywhere, not immediately, but enough. Enough that people begin to trust it, cautiously, tentatively, like testing the ground after a long storm, stepping carefully, listening for weakness, expecting, perhaps, that it might give way again, but it holds, at least for now. And now, a different kind of question begins to form, not about survival, not about victory, about meaning. What was this? What did it change? What remains? And like many important questions, it does not receive a clear answer, because the answer depends on where one stands. Some see victory, others see compromise, some see loss, others see necessity, some see a correction, others see a fracture, and all of them, in their own way, are correct, because this was never a simple movement, never a single idea, never a clean story. It was always layered, complicated, built from small decisions that became larger ones, from temporary solutions that became permanent structures, from beliefs that changed shape as they were carried forward. And those layers do not disappear when the fighting ends. They remain, settled into the fabric of things, invisible perhaps, but present in the way people think, in the way they question, in the way they accept or refuse to accept what is placed before them. And perhaps that is the most enduring change. Not what was won, not what was lost, but what was learned, quietly, indirectly, persistently, that the world, even when it appears solid, can be moved. Not easily, not without cost, but moved, and once that knowledge exists, it cannot be unlearned. It can be ignored, suppressed, hidden beneath new structures, but it remains, waiting, as all such knowledge does, for another moment, another pressure, another reason, another just this, because that is how it always begins, Not with a grand design, not with a clear plan, with something smaller, simpler, temporary, just this change, just this correction, just this adjustment. And from there, everything follows. Again